Welcome to the Adventures in CRE Audio Series. Join Michael Belasco and Spencer Burton as they pull back the curtain on everything commercial real estate and introduce you to some of the top minds in the industry. If you want to take your skills to the next level and be part of a growing community of CRE professionals across the world, this is for you.
Hello and welcome back to the Adventures in CRE Audio Series. Today we're joined by Aleksandr Gampel, and it's really cool. We have a very interesting, everybody wants to know technology, tech, construction, real estate. How do those things merge and how do they evolve over time? And so that's going to kind of frame the framework, but more so, Alex, first, thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. As I noted, I've been a fan of adventures in commercial real estate for many years now.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to have you. And I was looking at your LinkedIn profile, and I really like what you led with as the Cuby mission statement, I guess you would say. You said, "Nothing I've done previously matters as much or is as importantly needed by the world as our current mission at Cuby Technologies." So that's a big statement. In our pre-podcast scrum, I think there's a lot of merit here. So let's start there. I'll turn it over to Spencer to get us started, and we'll go from there.
So, Alex, you also have a follow-up line to that, which is an even bigger statement, which is cities built in days instead of years. Like, that's a lofty vision for where Cuby's going. Maybe for the audience, introduce yourself, introduce Cuby, and then let's talk about construction tech and what the future of construction looks like in the world.
Yeah, no, thanks guys, and thanks for having me. I think I come from a background that's very similar to most of your listeners and users of the website. Just traditional private equity real estate development. That's kind of been my origin story. It's a world I love, but tangentially, I've always loved technology. So I've never kind of kept an arm's length away from both. And what I'm doing now marries the two. I think Cuby is probably in the realm of what everyone's seeing today, which is how do you change construction, all the different companies that play in that sphere. I think historically it's been really hard to do so, and it remains to be a really challenging issue. So we'll see how well we live up to what you just referenced, and we hope to build cities in days instead of years. Cuby essentially is a technology company that's predicated on deep tech, meaning there's a hardware element to it, and the reason being is because we want to change construction the way we build buildings, and to do so we have to change physically the way we build buildings. And maybe if it helps, I'll start with kind of the background on the problem itself.
Sure.
Yeah. So everyone on this website focuses on real estate. A lot of real estate, and a big segment of it is development, agnostic to asset class. For us to build more buildings today, it's nearly impossible to meet the demand, not just the housing crisis and single family, multifamily, just any type of building we need more of. The issue that's happening today is there's not enough labor to deliver on those buildings, which is why costs are so high and developers are so squeezed on their returns and just aren't able to find as many deals. If you just take a step back for a second, construction overall hasn't changed in 200 years. We build buildings the same way we built buildings in the past. And I think there's a funny quote that sometimes I hear builders say, and it's, if Jesus were to come back to earth, the only thing he'd recognize is construction. I hear that one kind of often.
That's good.
And I think it remains true. And if you look at kind of every other industry historically, I think now every other industry is somewhere around 7 to 8x in terms of productivity efficiencies. And that comes from lean manufacturing, technology, cloud-based systems, et cetera. Construction is still at a 1x. So it's embraced technology in the least possible way. And if you kind of look at, finance even, which is, an old school, boring, traditional industry, I think 7 to 8% of R&D, or 7 to 8% of revenues allocated to R&D in construction, given that margins for general contractors average between, 5 and some percent. You can't do the same thing. So now you have kind of this slew of companies that are venture backed that are coming to the ecosystem and saying, hey, we think we can build better. It seems like the last frontier. That's kind of the realm that we play in. And before I move further, let me stop there for a second.
Yeah. So let me add on to this. many of our listeners know my, call it real estate origin story. And that is like, all of us have our story of why real estate. And mine was, I was in high school. I needed a job. A family friend had a plumbing company. He said, "Hey, I need workers." And I became an apprentice plumber. I did it for 4 years, basically spent 4 years of my life either in a warehouse, running around a warehouse, finding fittings and putting them in boxes and handing them to plumbers who would then go to the field, or in the field, essentially crawling around in crawl spaces and cutting plumbing pipe with kind of very rudimentary tools, and slapping glue on the pipe and the fitting and putting them together. That's 25 years ago. If you went to a single family construction site today, there would be a Spencer Burton on his knees in a crawl space, cutting pipe with a rudimentary tool and slapping glue on. I mean, construction has not changed. I mean, there are those who are trying to create software for change, but fundamentally construction changed. Michael, I mean, you've done construction, right? I mean,
yeah,
I did,
like yourself.
I was going to say, this is like Michael's background. Like this was, pre-real estate. This is what he was kind of doing, right, Michael?
Yeah, I was doing the same things as Spencer all over the place, doing rehabs, and yet it hasn't changed. And I have reasons in my mind for why. I'm not going to say, I'd love to hear, Alex, your thoughts, but it's been, for as long as I can remember, there have been tech companies talking about, tech/construction companies talking about disrupting the space and getting in there. And I've yet to see any real headway. And I'm curious, I'd love to hear your story more, where you guys are today, and then maybe talk about some of those issues, because it does seem primed for a revolution and something that's desperately needed. And I have my suspicion as to what some of these headwinds are, but I don't want to, take it in take it in your direction.
By the way, I come from also a similar background, so I'm kind of the skeptic in the room, and I think we have the same reasons as to why it hasn't changed. But just a little bit background on myself too. I come from a real estate family, so I've always been kind of around buildings. So I understand the layers to the problem, and just having someone come from the tech sector and trying to approach the space. I mean, there's a reason why prop tech, which now includes construction tech, scales so slowly. I think it's because many people don't come from the industry, so they don't understand that you might work with the most innovative developer in the world, for example, right? You're still constrained by your LP, by your conservative debt, by all the moving pieces that most people don't think about coming from tech and thinking, oh, building a building is easy, or buying a building is easy, et cetera. Anyways, no, the software piece, I think you covered it well for a second. I think software has been a natural, I mean, if you just think about venture and where venture dollars are going, right? Venture has a very simple equation. How big is the TAM, and how much of it can I disrupt and kind of build a company around it? Construction is the biggest industry in the world. I think it's 16% of the global kind of economic output. I think it's nearing 16 trillion plus by 2025. So it's a massive industry. It employs a ton of people. And then on top of that, it's actually the biggest pollutant as well, which most people don't talk about. So naturally for venture, construction seems like a sector that's just like, man, this should be where we focus our efforts. And that's why you have all these VCs and generalist VCs now investing in construction, TCCs, is because they don't understand construction, but they understand that the problem's massive. Software is a natural extension because it feels like it would scale better, and it seems like it's venture backable. And I agree with that. Software probably is more venture backable than being a modular or prefab or kind of asset heavy company. That being said, software is a band-aid for a lot of the construction processes, but not necessarily the way we build buildings. There's a great company called Mosaic, which I'm sure, Michael, that's maybe the one you were thinking about, that's innovating the process around how builders actually do what they do. So I think the way that Compass made brokers better, certain softwares make builders better. They don't necessarily change the way you sell a home or the way you build a home. Anyways, yeah, I mean, it's wild that, if I asked you today, Michael, how much does it cost to build building X, you wouldn't be able to tell me right off the top of your head. If I asked Toyota, how much does it cost to build a Camry on that given day, they'll tell me instantly. And that's kind of where everyone's trying to have construction move in that direction of lean manufacturing, which is the engineering principle, which is kind of how do you mass produce something in a repeatable, standardized way.
And it's especially relevant, like even in the investment side, there's some companies that are some of the largest in the space that use replacement costs is their major form of deciding whether they invest in something or not. And you could talk about, you could ask me today if I was quoted a price of a building 6 months ago, today it could be totally different. So add in that factor of just the fact that each component's price changes every day, and that becomes an incredibly complex process. So yeah, it's an ambitious goal you guys have. It's exciting to hear that you guys are undertaking this.
Well, let me dig into this a little bit more. So what about modular? What about prefab? What about some of this the 3D printed homes? Like, do they have opportunity to disrupt the space? What are the challenges, I guess, with those? I dealt with modular when I was developing in Panama. I mean, that was something we explored, and ultimately, the irony of how homes are developed in a lot of Latin American countries is you have one template and hundreds of homes that match that identical template. If there was ever a place where you should know the cost of your unit down to the penny, it would be that. And yet every one of our homes was built by hand, block by block. And the cost was greatly influenced by the weather, by cement costs. Then those would fluctuate up and down, labor, all those sorts of things. Anyway, so come back. What are some of the other solutions that people have to disrupt construction, and how are they being received? What are the likelihoods that they come together?
Well, you said something interesting there a second ago that I want to harp on, but
sure.
What you're assuming is that standardization is the way to go. But the real way to go is, how do you mass produce something at scale but have it be highly customizable? Because people want custom homes. It's your most intimate space. They want custom buildings, they want custom offices, hospitals, etc. So that's the one caveat I'd say is it can't just be standardization. That's not exactly the solution. But anyways, I mean, let's start with modular. Modular and prefab, those systems have been around for literally almost 100 years. Maybe not 100, maybe half a century. If you look at the way Russia, Soviet Union built homes, a bunch of concrete slabs that would just stack. That kind of is the most raw form of prefab. So it's existed, and modular companies have existed for a while. They just, Katera was maybe the first to spin it as a venture company, a bunch of tech, et cetera, and sold the narrative correctly. Modular works. I think the issue of modular is, and why don't I take a step back? There's modular, there's prefab, there's now 3D printing, there's a combination of those. This just shows you everyone's working on the problem. There's going to be more than one winner. There's just one that's going to be adopted quicker than another one. And there can be more than one winner because the space is so big. If you look at modular, I think the issue of modular to date is a lot of modular companies fall into two categories. They either sell a product, and I'll talk about why that maybe doesn't work, or they become this modular technology company that then starts being a GC and a builder as well. Like I said, GC is a terrible margin business generally. So to be a tech company that has GC margins doesn't really work for the return and cost of capital that you're getting from venture. But modular, just for your viewers who maybe don't know what modular is, think a box that gets essentially retrofitted to be something and then just stacked on top all throughout. That's modular. The reason why modular is kind of not the most efficient system is because we talked about lean manufacturing. So lean manufacturing is people want to build in the construction world the same way Tesla builds cars, or Toyota builds cars, or Boeing builds planes. So people will launch these gigafactories where you basically have a conveyor belt, like the Henry Ford conveyor belt, but Industry 4.0 conveyor belt, that's producing these modules. The problem is these modules, I mean, you're shipping a room across a country, basically. You're shipping it hundreds, if not thousands of miles, and you're shipping 100 of these rooms for a single project. Unless you have a ton of these giant gigafacilities all over, it becomes super uneconomical to use. The second issue of modular is that if you're Spencer Burton or Michael Velasco and you guys are developers and you are looking to do a project, modular is kind of finite in its customization. So it becomes a binary product that either works with your product or does not work with your product, which when I say product is your building. So there's a lot of limitations. On top of that, right, there's those certain layers to the onion that we talked about, which are uncontrollable. The red tape around inspectors, zoning, et cetera, right? Inspectors aren't necessarily the most, inspectors aren't the most progressive people. Municipalities aren't the most progressive people. So all of a sudden, an inspector can't look behind the walls of a modular building. They can't kind of check things. So unless you're Citizen M, which has gotten national approval in a lot of their modules, the hotel brand Citizen M, they went through kind of this national and international approval process. It's tough to replicate in every market. But really the biggest issue is if you're modular, you're shipping this big box of air across the country, and there's a huge supply chain logistics piece that just doesn't work. And then on top of that, like I said, these gigafactories that you launch, I argue that they're not real lean manufacturing techniques that are being employed, meaning it doesn't actually look like a Toyota conveyor belt, meaning that you have labor that's just traditional construction labor, a guy or a girl wearing a hard hat using a hammer and a drill and a saw, just now in a controlled environment like some sort of warehouse. So that's one approach. The second approach is a prefab, which just means that there's a kit of parts that get produced that then on site get put together. But same issue, you got to ship them thousands of miles, hundreds of miles, and it's just not as economical as you would expect after a certain radius. That's maybe a bit of a better approach, and there's been more companies scaling in that space. Maybe I'd say like almost a dozen now highly venture-backed companies that are, getting close to unicorns. I think Viva is an interesting one. I mean, they just raised a $400 million round, but Viva is an interesting one in the sense that they're a developer / GC turned kind of prefab company. Same issue with the larger facilities that have to be distributed, super capex intensive, et cetera. And now there's obviously 3D printing, which I'm the least bullish on, candidly. Maybe in markets like Texas where regulatory, it's okay and a bit laissez-faire, but here's where 3D printing fails, in my opinion. The reason why everyone is doing all this, going back to my original point, is everyone's trying to reduce labor costs. And to reduce labor costs, you got to reduce labor hours, right? And what lean manufacturing achieves is it allows you to produce a good with less labor hours. So in construction, if $1, right, and you guys know this better than I do, if $1 is, $1 of construction, 70% is probably labor, 30% is material. I think that's a fair assessment. What everyone's trying to do is reduce that 70% by factors. 3D printing doesn't accomplish that, because all 3D printing does is, for now, prints the shell of a single family home, right, which is just the first floor shell, which means that still 85% of the process needs to be finished using traditional labor. So you didn't reduce much there, on top of the regulatory issues and the capex intensity behind the machines, et cetera. And some folks have kind of a combination of both. I think where a lot of these groups vary is, one, the archetype of the product they produce. There's been a lot of groups focused on ADUs, which obviously is very applicable in California, right? And then a lot of players are focused on single family because it's kind of an easier attack point. It's a big housing crisis, et cetera. I haven't seen too many people divert into different asset classes, which, for example, we can, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then you have one group that's especially interesting called Assembly OSM, which spun out of Shop Architects here in New York. They're targeting modular, but for the urban ecosystem, which no one is doing, because it's very hard to get this product 50 stories type of thing. What we're doing though now, let me pause.
No. That's a really good setup for the challenges in the industry. So what's Cuby doing then? Like, how do you guys differentiate from these other solutions that have their downsides?
Yeah. So like I said, I come from real estate. I'm a boring real estate guy that happened to sometimes play in venture-backed tech companies. One I love to death. It's called Lifehouse. We were a hotel property manager that was tech-enabled, raised money from Tiger to Comcast to Sound, et cetera. And then I worked at WeWork, which is kind of a fun journey, which I'm sure a lot of your viewers are aware of. But my co-founder, on the contrary, who owns majority of the business, he's a deep tech entrepreneur from Europe. So he's done many hardware businesses to date, and actually launched an R&D studio in Europe, which had 200 deep tech engineers at all times. So you have a company that has IP, they go to him and they say, we'll pay you to catalyze this to mass production. So his whole expertise is in lean manufacturing and hardware and setting up factories, and this is kind of what he does. And the whole origin story of Cuby, right? It's he was building himself an HQ. He went to contractors in Europe and said, "Hey, like, what's the cost? How do we do this, et cetera?" And he was just baffled by the disjointed nature of kind of what they do in engineering and kind of the processes they set up for lean manufacturing versus where construction is. So he said, the easiest thing I could do is literally employ everything I know and books I've written into this space. So for the last 3 years, he and his team have been building essentially our technology, which are these factories and what they produce, et cetera, to build buildings. We met about a year ago because I was looking for a more interesting solution to construct because basis was just getting super expensive, and I wanted to see what's out there. And everyone was building an interesting solution, but everyone kept forgetting that all developers care about is cost. Until you make it cost effective, it doesn't matter, right? You can build the most over-engineered, complicated solution, but no developer will care unless maybe they're ESG focused. There's some sort of ESG element that maybe they'll overpay for. But relative to that, you guys aren't sacrificing your yield on cost for something, right? Just because. Yeah. So his system, I saw a way to commercialize it with him, and we're focused on cost and quality at the same time. And, basically just let's go back a second. I mean, what we're doing basically is we're setting up these mobile factories near or around construction sites to be able to produce kit of parts, that prefab methodology, except on site or near it within a 50-kilometer radius. So we're basically able, with a very low CapEx budget, set up what I explained to you looks like a tennis air dome, but is more of a repurposed military hangar for fighter jets, not non-pressurized inside. We can basically go and rent a parking lot, inflate it, the structure, put our equipment inside of it, and a lot of that equipment is proprietary to us because it needed to be scaled down because generally manufacturing equipment, it's meant to stay in one place. Ours needs to come apart, go to the next site. So we've scaled it down, and about 50% of it is off the shelf, 50% of it is proprietary to us. But essentially with these factories, and maybe Sam, you can put a video to one of our factory videos to your
sure. Yeah, we can roll. Yeah, we'll layer over some B-roll of that right now.
Yeah, just easier to visualize. But essentially, what we produce is a kit of parts. There's about 300 plus SKUs of kit of parts. The main component is a concrete-based panel system where MEP, HVAC, all of that is within it. So we basically produce everything in these mobile factories from foundation up, all the way to cabinetry if we wanted to. And what that allows us to do is to reduce that 70% cost equation associated with labor. Eventually, we'll reduce that by 10 times, as seen in other kind of industrialized lean manufacturing approaches across different verticals. So that's where we're going. So our manufacturing readiness level is about 85%. What that means is whatever we produce in these mobile factories, only 15% is left to traditional labor. Basically, it gets put together. And what's interesting and what we were able to do is, here's the difference between Eastern European engineers and kind of the US. Oleg always makes this joke. If there was a hole in a pipe and it's leaking water, right? US engineer will send some sort of sound wave, analyze it on the computer, right? Like over-engineer it, come up with, where the hole is. In Eastern Europe, you send a little, gas through there that's colored and you see where the leak is, right? What I mean to say that, but by that is like a simile to how people are over-engineering the solution here. We literally use the same construction materials, the same vendors. We just go about the process differently to produce a product that ultimately still feels and looks the same because we didn't want any red tape. So we're not focused on some end product. We're focused on the process of constructing.
That's very key. I'm thinking one thing. What happens to the mobilization fee?
What do you mean mobilization fee?
I used to own an excavation company, and every time we would deploy equipment, we had a fee, mobilization. I'm guessing that line item is going to increase just a little bit.
Yeah, I guess you didn't know that, Alex. But so Sam had a excavation company. It was actually a former septic tank company, right? That when you bought it, it was a septic tank company, and they moved into the construction side. So let me restate what I understand that Cuby does, and you tell me where I'm going wrong, and then I want Michael to shoot some holes in it a little bit and dig into where opportunities are. So if I understand right, currently we go out like as a construction worker, we go to the site. It's either raining or it's sunshine, it's cold or it's heat. We run by the shop and we pick up our materials, or we go by our supplier, we pick up the materials, we drop them off at site, and we literally assemble on site. In this case, you would have call it a manufacturing facility that is adjacent to the site or
50
very
kilometer
close to the site,
radius. Yeah.
within a 50 kilometer. Oh, so as much as 50. And in that contained building, you'd have pressure. It would be, temperature controlled. And so it would be a nice environment to work in. You'd have the right equipment, and therefore you would be more efficient in building. It's almost like bringing the prefab factory
That's exactly
to
it.
the site.
Well,
Is that
and it's kind of like you're templatizing something. I
Yes.
feel like what I've heard Alex say is the one thing that they have figured out how to templatize is labor, right? Where
Yeah, that's
modular
exactly right.
can do the same thing, but the big restriction is, okay, well, if you're going to do the same thing we're doing, you got to ship it 100,000, 1,000 miles, right? And so that breaks apart. So in effect, it's like, well, we're doing the same thing, but we're making it feasible based on our geography. So they're templatizing labor in a way. You've just done it in a more practical, actual, useful way.
I think there's also a caveat to that as well. Spencer and Michael will know this well, but skilled labor is especially the most expensive piece of construction, right? So
Right.
plumbing, your MEP setups, et cetera. We have practically, or the goal is, no skilled labor within these factories. So our flagship mobile factory has 130 laborers working in multiple shifts to build buildings and kits of parts to buildings. None of it is skilled labor. The whole point is that there's going to be a ton of SOPs that essentially you can get someone from McDonald's to work within our factory, train them in less than a week, and they'd be able to operate the job. The whole definition of lean manufacturing is you break up the parts to a process so much so that becomes the quality assurance. Someone's job is screwing a bolt, next job, right? Unless they do that correctly, second piece doesn't work. There's also something else that's interesting about our model. Remember when I told you that a lot of these groups are forced by default to be developers and GCs themselves? So one thing that we wanted to do is not play the game where the biggest incumbents, being, call it a Turner and Bechtel, who do 20 to 30 billion in revenue a year. It's so naive to say you're going to go put them out of business. Like it's not Netflix and Blockbuster. It literally cannot work that way. So instead, we thought the more interesting thing to do was to basically be like McDonald's. We have a bunch of SOPs. We have a franchise model. Someone buys a piece of hardware from us. We turn on the light switch. It's now yours. You've borne all the costs, but we've now created a 10x reduction in labor efficiencies for you. And that's really our model. So if you're a vertically integrated developer doing millions of square feet or a GC, our goal is eventually to sell to you and to basically have you buy a factory for us, for us to set it up, hire up, turn on the light switch, hand over the keys, and then we clip a royalty fee or a franchise fee off these factories. It's a much more economical way to scale. But the other thing that's important is these factories generally, for other groups, they can, Katerra's factories were $100 million facilities, right? Obviously that didn't work on a venture model in terms of scale. We've brought the price down of our flagship factory to sub $7 million. That in itself is a really interesting business from a P&L perspective, because that factory can do, 300,000 square feet per year at $180 a foot, right? I mean, you're talking about a decent business with a 30% margin. You can flip that to a PE shop at a 20x. But our goal is not to own these factories. It's again to sell them to someone.
Okay, so the developer in me, do you really save money, and does it really save time? And if so, how much? Yeah, by how much and how?
Yeah, I'll give you the anecdote kind of. So I come from your world. That's all I care about. I don't think systems like this work unless it's an actual cost-effective method. Because what we're doing is somewhat practical, that's how it becomes scalable. That's when I said when you over-engineer it, no longer works. From a developer standpoint, look, we're early, right? There's no kind of doubt there. If we were further ahead, right, we'd probably be buying a bunch of our own factories, and I'd have 100 of them over the country, and build a great manufacturing business in a weird cyclical environment that we're in. We're early, right? We've done about 100,000 hours of engineering work in terms of R&D, which is a lot. It takes 700,000 engineering hours to build a fighter jet. We're kind of at the 100,000 hour mark. So we're still early. We've built an MVP of a building. It's really nice. It's in Europe, right? European standard of quality is much higher than the stick-built homes we build in the US. There's actually another joke for Sam because he found the other one funny. In Europe, there's an anecdote that if you live in a US-based home and you put a gym on the second floor and you drop a weight, it goes straight through. Just because, like the homes we build, because of a cost equation, are generally not great because we can't afford to build better homes. But where I was going with that is we built our first kind of MVP home. We're right now concepting and launching our first V2 factory. We have our flagship is V3. Our kind of light version of our V3 is called the V2. We're launching the V2 right now in Europe. We're moving it to the suburbs of Philadelphia, Michael, in Richboro. Funny enough, we bought a 20-acre piece of land there.
I thought there's no reason. Isn't there no reason for Philadelphia to even exist? So
Yeah, what's going on in Philadelphia?
Well,
people live in Philadelphia too, by the way. So
it's a good market.
I'll check it out.
We have the most absurd story of how we ended up buying 20 acres of land. It's an old camp in the suburbs of Philly. It's just my partner bought it. It was a really weird situation. But anyways, we get a huge discount because what we're doing is kind of international. And the reason why we're doing it is because the hardest challenge right now for any startup is there's so much funding available. It's so easy to start a company these days. Everyone gets funded and then everyone competes for engineering talent. Because of Oleg's previous experience with this R&D center that he has, we can hire 40 engineers in a month and pay a fifth of the burn. And what construction is, end of the day, is an engineering problem. To solve an engineering problem, you spend engineering hours on it, right? So if we can attack those engineering hours, spending less, we can burn less capital and it takes us further. So when you ask, does this actually save us money? Yeah, that's the goal. So we're building a case study in that same region in Richboro. We're trying to do it from foundation up. We're talking concrete homes that I think will sell around $125 million. We're trying to do for $150 a foot. We were quoted by local GCs that it would cost to build the equivalent home around $230, $240 a foot. But again, these aren't.
Is that above grade, or is that development cost?
No, that's vertical costs post foundation.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. These are, Michael. These are concrete homes with full kind of interior finishes.
All right, so couple questions here. I'd love to ask. So first, what's the scale of buildings you guys are able to do?
Yeah.
What's the goal?
Yeah, so I didn't cover that. So like I said, every player in this space has kind of a subset that they're targeting. A lot of it is centered around ADUs and single family, just because we're now probably 10 million homes short in the US in terms of supply demand gaps. It's pretty insane. But because I told you we focus on a process of constructing, our only limitation really is 9 stories. And then don't give us a curveball. Don't tell me your structure is like a curved, weird something, architectural phenomena. Yeah. Our system is based on a 10 by 20 foot grid. Basically, we can do pretty much anything in that constraint, anything from a single family home to a 7-story hospital.
Cool. All right. So one of the things you had said, which feels like you guys cracked the code, and I wrote it down in my own paraphrasing.
We did not crack anything yet. This is the hardest.
Okay. All right. Maybe you're on your way, or maybe the answer is you don't know yet. Customized but automated, right? And this is what I found. And I kind of paraphrase that. It's not exactly what you said, but one of the things you said is, modular's cookie cutter, right? And if it fits your site, it fits, and if it doesn't, it doesn't, right? And you're bringing these factories within a 50-kilometer radius, and you can do this stuff. And it's essentially, I heard Toyota. It's like a Toyota factory. It's like McDonald's, Katera. And you mention these companies because these are companies that have sort of figured out the process. They know things by unit. When you plop a McDonald's down, it's the same process at every McDonald's. When you put a Camry out there, it's the same Camry. It's the same exact Camry.
Yeah, I have a really good analogy for you. Do you guys know what BMW is, right? And then there's Alpina, right? Like there's kind of like the layer above BMW of like their super high performance car, right? Mm-hmm. We have certain innovations on the end product. And remember I said the product is the factory. There's also product that we produce, which is the kit of parts to build the building, right? Mm-hmm. So the IP is on both. We have one piece of innovation, for example, it's magnetic facades, magnetic wallpapers, right? It's actually pretty interesting. We can use any vendor that ships tile or wood or wallpaper, and we just stick a film on it, and it plops on our panel system on the walls, for example. So to that extent, it's standardized, but it can still be customized. Obviously, price fluctuates depending on the finishes you want. That's up to you. Right. And then eventually, where we're going is like Airbnb is a real estate company that sells you a product, which is a stay, which is the experience, yet they don't own any real estate. We're going to be the top of funnel people want to build buildings, people want to work in offices. We're the top of funnel that then gets distributed to the localized distributed ecosystem of factories.
Oh,
Then we're building software too, where you guys know this better than anyone. You're underwriting a building, you don't know how to peg the costs right off the bat. You're going to have to go pay someone. There's a cost estimator. You hire a GC that bakes in a buffer. Then you hire an architect. We'll have software that both is going to do the kind of limitation customization of a building, meaning it's within the constraints and parameters of the factory, while also spitting you live costs side by side that you can just go and submit to the city.
So
where we want to go.
So where do you guys like anticipate entering during the design phase? Because the way I pictured it, it's like, you know, if everything was perfect and smooth, somebody would hand you guys a blueprint. It would almost like go into the factory, and then things would start happening. And that seems incredibly complicated because each development is unique in its own way. And so that's where I'm like, wow, that's a really challenging problem to solve right there in itself.
So, like I said, we're early, but we've been trying to work with certain developers just to build more case studies. And ideally, we're never going to work in a setting with just a one-off developer, right? We want to be kind of more of a B2B solution in a way that ultimately becomes B2B2C. But to date, developers have brought us their plans and said, can you build this? In most cases than not, the answer is yes. Maybe it doesn't perfectly fit on the 10 by 20 foot grid, so they adjust a little, right? There's certain things that adjust, but in most cases, we're able to output what they need. Yeah, I mean, listen, I'd say we're like 75% of buildings we could probably build that you bring us. Not everything is perfect. You might have to tweak the plans, etc.
Yeah. And then my other thought, and this is geographically, you know, I spent all of my life on either the East Coast or West Coast, surrounded or within big cities. And one of the notorious challenges for developers in big cities is not only the, you know, entitlements and costs and all that, but there is a very strong and organized labor force, which you could argue is a big reason why construction has not progressed in the way that other industries might have.
Yeah. So the way we think about unions, and by the way, I come from hotel world, so unions I'm too familiar with.
I didn't say you did. Unions.
Sure, I said union. That's fine. Which obviously exists for a reason. But to you, I'm saying that our goal is to reduce labor by 10x, right? In other words, you can also make that same labor 10x more productive, right? So whether you use a union or you don't, you know, it's 10x more production output is what you're gunning for, right? Those are two of the same things: 10x efficiency, 10x production improvement, right? Like 10x labor reduction. You're saying the same thing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. To a labor guy, though, you're hearing 10x less hours. But, you know, it's a problem. It's a challenge in the big. There are a lot of places without unions, though, so it's not.
Yeah, but watch, I can give you an ESG spin. We had a VC once give us a smart idea, really smart, deep tech VC. They said, go where jails are. There's a lot of, you know, labor that comes out of jails that can't necessarily plug into the, you know, white collar ecosystem that we live in today, less manufacturing jobs, less blue collar jobs. You know, that could be an interesting funnel of labor for us. You know, we've thought about that, but I mean, labor is an issue across the board, but we're just hoping we're not dependent on skilled labor.
Cool. Yeah, it's ingenious. I mean, I love how you're describing this. You know, it's definitely a huge problem. Okay.
Yeah, the one thing we also didn't describe in external pressure that GCs are facing. I mean, no one realizes this, but I mean, everyone thinks, you know, airlines are so polluting, the airline industry. Construction is way far more polluting than any other industry. If you just look at landfills, I think 40% of landfills are construction waste, ground up construction from rework, et cetera. So there's going to be external pressure to adopt. We are kind of interesting because we still like concrete. Everyone is really upset about concrete. There's a lot of embodied carbon, right? Unfortunately, it's one of those materials that's super cost effective and widely available in the amount of buildings we need to build. I don't think we're ever supplementing concrete. We are working on something really interesting within our concrete. It's a form of misconduce, which is a silver grass. You know, it's like a thin grass. If you guys Google silver grass, we'll eventually use that as pellets, as rebar within our concrete, which will become super interesting to offset the concrete embodiment of carbon. And then also we kind of have this more practical solution. We don't have nearly as much waste when constructing, because, you construct, you throw your thumb in there and you kind of have a piece that, you need that you don't, et cetera. Here we kind of are conceptualizing a building on the computer before anything ever gets produced. So we have 1-for-1 parts for that building. And then on top of that, we don't ship something 1,000 miles, right? So there's literal emissions when you have to ship something. So there's a huge sustainability angle that for now, just so much to do. It's too early to talk about, but it's going to be a huge angle. And here's another thing, by the way, about the localized factory approach. Everyone that does modular prefab, et cetera, it's exactly what you said, Michael. It's this whole local economy thing, right? If your factory is way far away from where you're building, you just killed a bunch of jobs. You killed a bunch of local vendors and businesses. You haven't paid local taxes. At scale, people will talk about that. No one's talking about it because there hasn't been mass adoption in this ecosystem yet. Yeah. So we don't.
No, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm really excited, Alex, to follow this. Yeah, keep us and the A.CRE audience in the loop as to how Cuby progresses. Sam, let's make sure we get Alex back on to talk about this and other things.
Cool.
Great insights, Alex. Really appreciate your coming on today. Sam?
Yeah.
I was just going to say,
go ahead, Alex.
I was just going to say, Spencer and Michael, thank you for making all those models that have supported many of us over the years. I think you guys are doing the real social good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well, really interesting content. I mean, we talk with, especially the last couple of 3 or 4 guests we've had on, all talking about new ways of using technology in a lot of different ways. And so I think the next 5-10 years in real estate are going to be incredible. So anyway, thank you for watching, and we will catch everybody on the next episode.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Adventures in CRE Audio Series. For show notes and additional resources, head over to www.adventuresincre.com/audio series. Would you like to learn real estate financial modeling in a matter of weeks and do it with zero guesswork? If so, the A.CRE Accelerator is for you. The Accelerator is a step-by-step, case-based program designed to teach you exactly what you need to know and in the order you need to know it, so you can gain both the knowledge and experience to take your career to the next level. To see if the Accelerator is right for you, go to www.adventuresincre.com/accelerator.